started the recording. Welcome everyone to the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon. We do these once in a while to discuss the intersection between neuroscience and philosophy and to push the boundaries of concepts and challenging issues that surround our both disciplines, both from the neuroscience side and the philosophy side. There's no priority here. We go in both directions, and we really are looking forward to the discussion today by Ross and Dani Bassett that is going to follow up and present the really exciting paper that was just published maybe just a few weeks ago on Nature Reviews Neuroscience, entitled Causation in Neuroscience, Keeping Mechanisms Meaningful. And let me just briefly say a few words about them before we get started. So Lauren Ross is associate professor in the Logic and Philosophy of Science department at the University of California, Irvine. And her research concerns or interests center on the explanation and causation in biology, neuroscience, and medicine. And Dani Bassett is professor at the University of Pennsylvania with primary appointment in the Department of Bioengineering, but lots of other secondary appointments in physics and astronomy, in electrical and systems engineering, and neurology and psychiatry, and also an external professor at the Santa Fe Institute. And Dani's lab studies biological, physical, and social systems by using and developing tools from network science and complex systems theory. So what we're going to be doing today is a salon in which both Lauren and Dani will present their ideas for the first 20, 30, 40 minutes, and we'll see how that goes, depending on how long they want to present and discuss, introduce the main concepts. And then after that, what we really want to do is engage all of us in a discussion of these really challenging, but also really important concepts for philosophy and for neuroscience. So Laurie and Dani, welcome again to the salon. Thanks so much for joining us and leading this discussion. I don't know which order you want to take. Well, I guess the slide here lists both of you. Take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Luis, for the introduction and for organizing this. It's our pleasure to have this discussion, and part of what we were hoping is that this kind of paper would encourage this in the first place. So as Luis just mentioned, our plan will be to first discuss and give a brief overview of the main points in the paper that we make and argue for, and then open things up for discussion. The starting place of the paper, which as you all can see is titled Causation in Neuroscience, Keeping Mechanism Meaningful, is that a fundamental goal in neuroscience, of course, is to uncover causal structure of the brain. Of course, the causal structure is structure and causal information at many different scales. This can be the lower scales of molecular and cellular interactions, higher scales of neurocircuitry. The goal of identifying and uncovering the causal structure of the brain is understandable given the implications of causal information and what it allows us to do. Causal information and causal relationships support control. Causal factors are factors that are targets that we can use to provide explanations, to provide understanding, and in some cases to make changes, right? Causes are factors that have control over their effects, and that are factors such that if they were changed, they can change outcomes. So, in many ways, it's very understandable to have this goal of identifying the causal structure of the brain. What's interesting is that in the context of the focus and interest in uncovering causal structure, one of the most frequently used causal concepts to refer to this structure, and most commonly used causal concepts in the field, is of course the term mechanism. There are many examples that reveal the usage of this term in the field: cellular mechanisms, circuit mechanisms, systems level mechanisms, cognitive, network, global. You probably know of many other examples that aren't even on this slide. What's interesting is that it isn't just the case that this causal concept mechanism is common in neuroscience, it's also explicitly found and mentioned in guidelines and journals that specify what kinds of work will and won't be published, and guidelines in grant and funding inquiries that specify what types of research will and won't be funded. So in this paper, we have two tables that provide some examples of this in a number of journals in the field. The guidelines that you find for what types of work are published specify that the journal rarely publishes case reports unless they definitively identify a new mechanism of disease or treatment. The review should be integrated into a mechanistic model. The journal focuses on work that concerns basic mechanisms underlying neurological disorders, and they especially encourage work that is identifying or revealing novel mechanisms of action. In addition to finding the mechanism term in these publication guidelines, we also see it, of course, in grant and funding information for what types of work is supported and funded, right? We see this in guidelines provided by the NIH, NSF, for example. So the NIMH requires an experimental therapeutics approach that generates information about the mechanisms underlying a disorder. They accept only mechanistic clinical trial applications. They're funding work that is aimed at understanding fundamental mechanisms, increasing understanding of the neural mechanisms for human cognition, and supporting mechanistic studies, and so on. Now, it isn't just the case that the mechanism term is found in the specification of standards in journals and grant and funding inquiries. Of course, it's very commonly used in the field. It's often suggested that mechanism is a kind of fundamental unit of the brain that is important or essential for getting understanding of the brain, getting explanations of brain behaviors and brain outcomes. What's interesting and important is that while mechanism is very commonly used in neuroscience and found in these standards, it's used in completely different ways that are rarely distinguished, right? So very interesting for a term that's viewed as necessary to get your work published and funded, but also necessary to get understanding of the brain. There isn't a single main way that the term mechanism is used, and there isn't consensus on kind of what counts as a mechanism. This leads to, we suggest, miscommunication, unintended meanings, a lack of clarity. So a main goal of the paper is to essentially explore the many different meanings of mechanism in the field and the implications for the variable usage of the term. The focus of the paper involves four main points, and these are the four main points that we'll provide an overview of in the rest of these slides. So in the very first part of this paper, we give an overview of discussions of mechanism in the philosophy of science literature. In philosophy of science and philosophy of neuroscience, there's also been interest in mechanism, specifying what kind of causal structure this refers to, and how it figures in explanations in neuroscience. In the second part of the paper, we look to the use of this term in neuroscience, and we describe three non-exhaustive ways in which the mechanism concept is used. There are three uses of the term that we suggest are very common in the field, and we describe what these are. In the third part of the paper, we outline challenges that are produced by the variable usage of the mechanism term in the field. And then in the final part, we provide suggestions for moving forward. So We'll start things off with the very first of these 4 steps of the paper. In the beginning of the paper, we introduce and discuss focus on causation and focus on mechanism in philosophy of science and philosophy of neuroscience. Of course, as you probably know, causation is a topic that currently receives a lot of attention in philosophy, and it's received a lot of attention for quite some time, right? At least 2 millennia. Causation receives a lot of attention for many reasons. One of them is that it's viewed as essential for providing explanations of outcomes, phenomena, effects in the world. Getting causal information is about a system is viewed as getting information and being able to specify how the system works, how it functions, how it behaves. And in philosophy, we often distinguish the kind of understanding that causal information provides. We often distinguish that from other projects that don't give you deep understanding or deep explanations. For example, a scientist can provide descriptions of outcomes, they can classify outcomes, they can even make predictions, but none of these is giving you the ability to explain why a system has produced a certain behavior. Causal information allows us to do that, and we often distinguish it from these other projects, right, that are kind of merely descriptive, in some cases, merely predictive from getting information and having models that allow you to explain. So causality, causal information is very important for capturing how scientists explain. In the context of this interest in causation, there's been a lot of focus on mechanism in philosophy of science and philosophy of neuroscience in particular. It's, appreciated that scientists often use the term mechanism when they provide explanations, but to take things back to earlier philosophical work, the kind of use of the term mechanism in science is also said to originate in kind of earlier philosophical work in these earlier mechanical philosophies of Descartes, Newton, and Boyle, where you have these types of work that are comparing living systems to machines and to mechanical systems. So the suggestion is that if you want to understand living systems, how they produce behaviors, how they function, that you should think of them like a machine. In particular, you should identify the lower level causal parts of that system, how they all work together, how they mechanically interact together to produce that behavior. So the kind of early uses of mechanism in philosophy and in science are related to the machine analogy and the machine metaphor. As you can see, this is a somewhat reductive sense of a causal system because the causal parts are at a lower level. You can also see that the causal interactions are kind of physically interacting. In modern philosophy of neuroscience, there's interest in mechanism, and it's related to this earlier work on mechanism from the 17th century, but it's more focused on modern use of mechanism in neuroscience. And there's a lot of questions in this current space in philosophy of neuroscience about what mechanism actually means, what it refers to. So some of the questions in my field that are kind of pressing modern questions that we're interested in are all explanations in neuroscience mechanistic, right? Of course, this depends on what mechanism means. Other questions that come up are things like, do other types of causal concepts and causal structures explain? So if we're interested in causal explanation in neuroscience, what types of causal systems give explanations? Are they all mechanistic causal systems? What does this mean? If they're not, what are the other types of causal systems that explain? So this is a little bit of a primer on philosophy of neuroscience to suggest there's a lot of interest in causation, and the mechanism concept has come up there as well. So turning to neuroscience, we're interested, of course, in how the term mechanism is used in neuroscience and what the implications of this usage is. are, what these implications are. Part of what we suggest in the paper is that mechanism is used in different ways in the field, and we outline three main ways that it's used. These are not exhaustive, but they're kind of three main uses that you see showing up repeatedly. A first way that mechanism is used in the field, we suggest, is it's used in a narrow sense, where mechanism is used to refer to only some types of causal systems. It's used to refer to causal systems that have certain features, particularly causal systems with lower level parts, where those parts have physical interactions. There's more fine-grained detail about the causal system. So at the very bottom of the slide, you see 4 different types of causal systems. On this first narrow usage of mechanism, only the first 2 count as real, genuine mechanisms, right? You've got your ion channel mechanism, signal propagation mechanism, systems with a lower level molecular detail. The first usage of mechanism, as you can see, is quite reductive. One hint that it's being used is when the mechanism is said to underlie a system, a network, a topology, and right, you can see that there's reference to the mechanism being something that is operating at a lower scale or involves components at a lower scale. This is a reductive use because of that focus on lower level causal parts. And it's narrow because it only applies to some causal systems and not others. So on this usage, a molecular causal system is a mechanism, but our topological causal systems and other kind of macro scale causal systems don't count. So this is a first usage. A second usage is quite broad. On the second broad usage of mechanism, the causal systems that count as mechanistic include systems that have causality. This is used very broadly to refer to and to include a wide class of causal systems that have different features. So if you look at the causal systems on the bottom of the slide, the broad usage of mechanism includes all of these as mechanisms. The broad usage of the term includes the systems that the narrow usage picked out, but also others. Systems that are more abstract, that have higher scale causal connections, right, are circuits, are topological mechanisms, network mechanisms, and so on. So these are 2 different uses of the mechanism term in the field. And there's a third and final usage that we suggest is also present, and this is a non-causal use of the term. In some cases, the term mechanism appears to be used to refer to systems or models that don't yet have causal information. And we discuss a few examples of this. Some examples are cases where there's an interest in, where there's a discussion of correlates or realizers, right? Like the neural correlates of consciousness, where you have important relationships of realization and correlation, but where these aren't yet clearly causal, right? Relationships of causality are different from relationships of mere correlation or realization. There's also a number of cases where some mathematical models are referred to as mechanistic, but it isn't clear if the dependency relations in those models capture causal relationships, or if instead they capture important mathematical dependencies that allow you to explain, but where the explanation isn't powered by causality, right? And that's a topic that receives a lot of discussion in philosophy of neuroscience. But the suggestion here is that mechanism is even used in some cases to refer to systems where it's not clear that we have causality yet, and that they're not representing causal relationships. So part of what we can see is that in this order, the 3 uses of mechanism are broadening with each usage. In the very first usage, it's referring to a particular class of causal systems. In the second, it's referring to just about any causal system. In the third, it's being stretched so much that it's even being used to refer to systems and models that are non-causal. In the next part of our paper, we explore what happens and some of the challenges that result from this variable usage of mechanism in the field. So what happens when the field uses the term mechanism in these different ways? And we provide 5 main suggestions for challenges that the variable usage of mechanism results in. The first challenge that we outline is that the different meanings of mechanism lead to a lack of clarity in the field. One example of this is seen in the peer review process, where you find reviewers in pretty heated disagreements about whether a mechanism has been identified in a paper that's submitted to a journal or not. So these reviewers are disagreeing. Sometimes the authors are involved as well, of course, about whether mechanistic insight has been provided by the paper at all. What's interesting is that editors for various scientific journals also explicitly acknowledge this in right, they're on record for acknowledging this kind of disagreement. So editors have said that the mechanism standard is cause for much uncertainty, mostly pertaining to what actually constitutes mechanistic insight. This, of course, is very interesting, and you might think potentially problematic because the standard for getting your paper into the journal, right, the guidelines of the journal are to identify mechanisms and provide mechanistic insight. But as it turns out, there's disagreement over what this actually means, right? When the standard has been met or not. A second challenge that we identify, and which is related to the first, is miscommunication. One clear way in which this shows up in many different contexts is that one meaning of mechanism is intended, but there's another meaning of mechanism that is assumed. So if a scientist is communicating their work to the public and they're using mechanism in a broader sense, but it's interpreted in a narrow sense, right? It's being suggested that some kind of lower level causal information is being provided when that's not the case. You can imagine how this can play out in grant and funding inquiries where there's an interest in supporting work that is identifying causal information that either is captured by the narrow or the broad usage, but this is misinterpreted by those reading the funding inquiries in the first place. A third challenge that we outline has to do with this variable usage supporting reductive assumptions. In particular, when the narrow notion of mechanism is assumed, this can misleadingly suggest that causal understanding in neuroscience is always reductive, that it always requires molecular or cellular understanding. So if mechanism is being intended or used in the broad sense, but this kind of narrow reductive notion is associated with the mechanism concept, it can unintentionally support this kind of reductive assumption that real understanding of the brain requires lower level causal detail. A fourth is confusion about causation. In some sense, this is somewhat obvious because if mechanism is a causal concept, but it's being used to refer to systems and models that are not causal, this is going to lead to all sorts of confusions, right? About when causality has been identified. It can conflate relationships of correlation, realization with causality. And a fifth and final challenge that we outline in the paper, and one that we find quite important, is the sense in which the different meanings of mechanism can support undesirable incentives. Part of what we suggest is that the mechanism term is a kind of status term in the field. It might be used by a researcher or a scientist when they're signaling that they're doing work that's important, work that's explanatory. But of course, you don't have the kind of precision with respect to, you know, what the term mechanism, means with respect to their work. So one way in which this plays out, we suggest, is the following. Suppose you have a scientist who's working with the narrow reductive notion of mechanism. If a scientist is working with this more reductive notion of mechanism, this can make it easy to dismiss theorizing that doesn't have this reductive feature, theorizing that involves dynamical systems, computational work, to dismiss it as not really revealing mechanisms and as unworthy or less worthy. Alternatively, if you have a scientist that is doing this non-reductive work, it can be tempting to argue that it's mechanistic after all, right, in some extended sense of mechanism, right? Because mechanism is, right, an important standard of the field. Part of what we suggest is that this dialectic is undesirable. The focus should be directly on the strengths and weaknesses of the work and not on whether it's correct to call it mechanistic or not. So in some cases, the term is kind of confusing what type of work is valuable, whether, what its strengths and weaknesses are. And so a kind of final challenge is this sense in which the variable uses can support some of these undesirable incentives. In terms of moving forward, what suggestions do we provide in the paper? The first one, as you can imagine, when mechanism is used, its meaning should be specified, right? What exactly is meant by mechanism? And in saying more here, one thing that we consider is the function of the concept mechanism. If the function of mechanism is to capture causal information, this allows us to suggest that the third usage of mechanism is quite disadvantageous, right? Because it's picking out and used to refer to systems and models that don't have causality in them. So if this is the function, then the third usage is pretty disadvantageous. If the function of the mechanism term is to capture different types of causal systems, then the second usage is disadvantageous. The second broad usage can make the mechanism term less meaningful because this usage can make it synonymous with just any causal system. Mechanism just means you have causality, right? You have a causal model. If the goal is to be able to distinguish different types of causal relationships and causal systems, and if we want to capture different causal concepts that show up in the field and different types of causal systems they refer to, you might think that preserving and using a definition that's narrow allows you this kind of precision. So part of what we suggest is that the first usage has many advantages. It's allowing one to communicate specific information about causal systems. It's also, in some cases, a kind of default or expected usage in some areas of the field. There's also historical precedence for using mechanism in that narrower, more reductive way. However, one thing we want to be very clear about is that if we were to adopt this first usage of mechanism to restrict it in the narrow sense, this doesn't imply that all causal explanations in neuroscience should cite lower scale details. Instead, it's creating room for other macro scale abstract causal systems that also allow us to explain. These macro scale abstract causal systems are distinct from others. We want to capture what their features are, right? They have unique features, and there's implications of those unique features for the types of behaviors that they can explain. So understanding the brain doesn't involve prioritizing one scale of causal detail over another. The suggestion is that using the concept in a way that is precise allows us to make these distinctions and to clearly communicate and pick out different types of causes, causal relationships, and causal systems that are found in the field and that we need to understand the causal structure of the brain and to give explanations of it. So in conclusion, mechanism is very common in neuroscience, right? Perhaps the most commonly used causal concept in the field. But in looking forward, we suggest that it should be placed in the context of other causal concepts that are also used. Neuroscience contains a very rich causal language. Mechanism isn't the only causal term. There's others that were mentioned here and that are mentioned in the paper: pathways, cascades, circuits, causal topologies. In a number of these cases, you might think that the concept and causal term that's being used is invoking different types of analogies that are highlighting unique features of the causal system. So when you're referring to a system as more mechanistic or machine-like, you might be saying something about lower level causal parts. When you refer to a system as a pathway, you might be suggesting that it's more similar to roadways or to a conduit, right? Other causal concepts like circuits are invoking this analogy to computers and computation. Being able to precisely specify what the unique features of these causal systems are, right, is important for capturing different types of causality, causal systems, ways of understanding the causal structure of the brain, in the sense in which those different features allow us to give different explanations. Further questions, of course, what definition of causality best captures usage in the field? Does including lower scale causal information always improve an explanation? What standards do legitimate causal explanations need to meet? Of course, this is extremely important for journals and funding agencies that are specifying what types of work meets their standards. And as you can tell, this is a paper that is very much combining a kind of theoretical focus, philosophical focus, but it's also very practical, right? We're suggesting that the differing usage of mechanism has practical implications for the field. Of course, we're also not assuming that there are clear answers to these questions or even single answers to them. One of our main points for the paper is to support clear discussion in the field, to indicate the need for this discussion, and to suggest that one place to start is with the many meanings of mechanism that show up in the field. So that is a kind of brief overview of the paper. Happy to have either Dani weigh in now and or to get the discussion kickstarted.
Thank you so much, Lauren. That was a really great way to get it started. Dani, would you like to add
Yeah.
anything? I mean, how do you?
I think just that I really appreciate, Lauren, the way that you framed summarized the paper and its main contributions and the questions and challenges that that it raises for the way that we're doing neuroscience now and the way that we're communicating neuroscience now. So yeah, I'm excited to just turn over to the discussion.
Okay, great. Well, before opening up, I wanted to just encourage everyone to send questions. Also, if you prefer that I read off your question. I know that I don't want to steer anything in any particular direction, but I know that Conrad is in a whole day meeting today and just kind of back and forth and just had a few minutes. So Conrad, I know that you need to run. So would you like to briefly get things started? Just and I apologize if the others raised their hands slightly earlier. But if Conrad, if you have a couple of points that you want to make, then we can still squeeze you in before you jump to another meeting.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks so much. Like the place where I'm coming from is that I represent probably the most prominent field that was always denied the term mechanism. So I've been doing Bayesian psychophysics. I look at how people solve problems. I find that people solve problems in a way that can be predicted by them optimally solving the problem in the context of uncertainty and optimal control and like all those things. So the interesting thing is like the Bayesian psychophysics field has always been part of neuroscience at some level. We went to the neuroscience conferences. We were part of the movement community. We were always part of it. But the one thing that they never gave us is the word mechanism. And I remember as a young student, I would go up and give my talk about like how I explain behavior much better than like any of the neuro folks could. And every single time one of these like big, famous, important neuroscientists go up and said, hold on, that means nothing about the brain, no? And I'm like, what do you mean? It doesn't mean nothing about the brain. It predicts how behavior works. And they're like, no, but like it doesn't tell us the mechanism of how the brain works. And all I could always say is like, and neither does what you say. But it's kind of the word mechanism that was so powerful. And the Bayesian psychophysics folks, despite being so successful at modeling things, never get funding out of neuroscience sources. And it was incredibly powerful and it was incredibly painful for anyone in the field. And what did they do? They basically said, look, we don't claim mechanism because in our definition of mechanism, they had like a causal definition all along, in my view. They didn't feel like they had a right to claim mechanism. And some of the leading people in the field basically said, we don't have mechanism, let's get over it. And so I just wanted to share that perspective from how powerful being denied the word mechanism is.
Yeah, I let me just say one thing. I mean, Lauren summarized in maybe the last few sentences that the paper is philosophical, conceptual, etc., and practical. And I could not agree more that this is the perfect example, right, of denying in practice access of a whole large sector, subsector of this space of neuroscience, or the legitimacy in a way to address certain things because it doesn't fall in the wording and the mechanism according to some interpretations. But I'll let Lauren and Dani share their views on your explanation, Conrad. Yeah, Lauren, Dani, do you have anything that you want to react to?
Maybe just quickly chiming in to say that I think that your experience is one that people have across several subfields related or connected to neuroscience. And so I'm sure there are many people in this virtual room that have similar memories of earlier times or of times today. I think one of our hopes with this paper is to give people more language to verbalize what the issue actually is and in the communication. And also, I think a lot of Lauren's work points to the fact that that mechanism is not the only kind of causal structure that is relevant for neuroscience. And that's something that I think that all our fields need to be understanding and embracing more. Lauren, I don't know if you have additional thoughts.
No, I think I'll kind of leave it at that, unless there was more that Conrad wanted to say.
Conrad, do you have any follow-up to that?
No, I mean, like, look, the thing is kind of then ultimately what we use as mechanism, and I think like, or how we want to define it. And I think the paper makes kind of an inclusive argument for mechanism. Maybe I've incorporated the hate against my field so much that I don't view it like that anymore. Like, but another possibility is not like to come up with a very tight definition where you could say the definition of causality is what the influence of a potential perturbation is. And when we can establish that mechanism in the narrow definition, like there's the wide inclusive definition that the paper advances. There's also the narrow definition. We kind of want the perturbative causality plus like what is the reductionist component of that. And what I like about that definition is like it's very precise and it's very difficult. Like and at some level your paper reflects that. Now, like building like a definition of the word mechanism that contains all the things that we as neuroscientists call mechanism is difficult. And it's difficult to then come up with like a definition of what's mechanism and what isn't mechanism.
Okay, all right. Let's open it up again. And so, Randy, do you want to follow up with your question or your comment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thank you, Lauren and Dani, for the presentations. I like the paper. I like its implications. I think one of the challenges that in not just neuroscience, but I guess science in general, is the value we add to certain terms that are used. And certainly in the examples you gave, Lauren, from the publications and from the grant calls, mechanism is kind of considered the pinnacle in some respects of achievement. And certainly in Conrad's comments, in terms of how the feedback he got from his work, suggests that the most valuable aspect in science is to identify a mechanism. And I'm wondering if that might be something we could also think about, how to reframe the value of mechanism versus being able to identify, for example, a causal structure, and whether identifying a causal structure potentially independent of a mechanism could be as valuable for providing some understanding and explanation, is the other term that you've used in the past. So I'm just kind of wondering about, thinking about what the value of mechanism is relative to other concepts that you covered in the paper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the suggestion early on in the paper, and of course, what's unsurprising is that mechanism is valuable to us in something that's important because causal information is valuable to us. Identifying causal structures is important, right? That allows us to get all sorts of things. That allows us to get explanations, to get understanding, to ultimately get control. I think part of what we have leaned on and what we're trying to capture here, which is very compatible with what you're saying, is that identifying causal stuff in the brain is important. And it's sort of like, well, what types of causal stuff? What types of causal systems? There's very different types of features that causes, causal relationships, causal systems can have. And there's different reasons for why having language or even the ability to refer to those differences is very useful and valuable. Maybe some types of causal information are more valuable for understanding different types of behaviors in the brain. And at the very least, I mean, you might think that we kind of see this in the work. There are causal terms that are already out there that appear to be referring to different types of causal systems. So if they're all kind of collapsed into the kind of term mechanism, then it's harder to see those differences. And yeah, there's a sense, I mean, part of what we see in philosophy of science is it would almost be useful if you just put the term mechanism off to the side and said, what kind of causal system do you have? What kind of causal system do you want? What are its features? Mechanism can really cloud a lot of that. So if you have a cause, if you have a causal system with lower level parts, that's unique and that's different from other types of macro level causal relationships. If you have, a cause that differs with respect to strength, stability, reversibility, irreversibility, there's just lots of varieties, causes and causal systems. So, I mean, one thing we were interested in the paper is it's one thing to talk about that philosophically, but it looks like it actually matters a lot. There's a lot of implications in the field for this one blanket term being used to kind of cover up all of those distinctions. And there's reasons to be kind of concerned about that. So yeah, just as you say, sometimes putting mechanism aside and just saying, what kind of causal system do we want? What kind of causal system do we have? What kind of causal information do we need to give the best, explanation here, or one that's more complete is far more useful, especially, of course, if mechanism is defined in different ways, then talking about those definitions and meanings gets you around that kind of challenge.
Yeah, and I'm not a philosopher of science, so I'm kind of wondering as well, if you look at mechanism and how it's being used in other scientific applications, if it has the same challenges there. Like if you look at mechanisms, physics is a pretty extreme example, but other like biology, genetics, for example, even in sort of social sciences, we talk about mechanisms, is the ambiguity equivalent there as well?
I think we see a similar situation in other scientific fields where mechanism is a status term. Yeah, right. And in economics and the social sciences, it isn't enough in some cases for the scientists to say, we have found a strong, stable causal relationship. This is a mechanism. It's an interesting feature of the term and kind of what it means in different communities. But yeah, very similarly a kind of status term, and it can lead to all other similar types of confusions too, of course. In those cases, you have very nice macro level causal systems and relationships, and mechanism, right, suggests that there's something more reductive when there isn't. But yeah, I think interesting to see similarities between neuroscience and other fields.
Thank you. Randy, any follow-up or?
That's good. There's a lot of other questions, so I'll let you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and you can circle back when we finish the questions. So, Alexei, do you wanna let us know your thoughts, your questions?
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the paper. It's wonderful. The question that I have is in the glossary section, when you define causality, you're very careful. You don't use time. And what I was going to ask you about is, perhaps to both of you, Dani and Lauren, is there another assumption that maybe not mentioned in the paper that mechanists, they assume Newtonian time, objective, observer independent, because, usually people think that cause precedes the effect. And the reason I'm asking is sort of, it may seem like not really related to neuroscience, but I think it is because we're looking at complex hierarchical multi-scale architecture. And, I attended Chris Field's course of Physics as Information Processing, which is quantum information theory. And he uses communication as the primary ontological entity. Then he derives time. And then there's, Einstein and all the other things. So is that really not talked about enough, that people imply that time just flows, it's objective, and that is what it is. And, on the synapse level and in the mind level, time is sort of the same thing, and we just not talk about it. The reason I'm mentioning it seems a little abstract, but I'm a psychologist, and I think if we move away from molecules to the level of the mind, then, it's very important, and temporal depth and time perception, they vary. And I don't know if that's talked about when we just say this causes that, if time is even, talked about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And there's so many complexities with respect to how causation is defined that, as you just indicated, and as you can tell, we don't get into in this paper. The relationship between causality and time is complicated, and there are, of course, many different definitions or accounts of causality in both kind of more formal computer science contexts and in philosophy. A number of them don't connect up time in their definition for various reasons, although in these contexts and in just about all of these like life science contexts that we're interested in, it is the case that the cause precedes the effect, right? And there's a clear temporal understanding of that. One of the main features of these definitions, partly some that Conrad alluded to in these Bayesian frameworks, and in a lot of the philosophy of science literature that I'm working with, is understanding causation in terms of control. So when you get causal information, it's information that should tell you something about control. Causes are factors that provide control over their effects. So they lean on control much more than time, which is interesting. But as you can see, we did not have time in this paper, and coming to a consensus on how to define causality is its own very big topic and very big question. But interestingly, in a number of current accounts of causality, time is kind of put off to the side. But as you suggest, there's many complications for how it relates. of course, like one distinction we see is that causes take place on different timescales. That matters quite a bit, right? Especially in the life sciences. So it's related in really interesting ways. And yeah, you can see in the glossary that we're sticking to something that is a little more that's a little more kind of accurate, while appreciating that there's lots of debates about how exactly to define causation, and that hopefully will come up in future discussions and we'll need to with mechanism, which is a causal concept. So yeah, thank you for that.
All right, thanks. Alexei, do you have anything that you want to add, or you're muted?
I'm very grateful for your response. I wonder if Dani has any comments on, from the physics standpoint, if we, move into, I don't know, different framework for time, how this would change the debate on causality.
Yeah, my intuition is that when that some of the notions of mechanism, or sorry, of cause, including mechanism, that Lauren described in the slides and in the paper, and that others have used in prior work, some of them assume a particular kind of time, or a relevance of time for the notion of cause. I think that means that when and if we move to other notions of time, that may just expand the notions of cause that we have to define, or want to define, or want to be clear about distinctions among. And so that will be an increase, that will be a interesting conversation to have at that stage. I think the points that are made in the paper, however, are independent of that conversation to some degree, because they are identifying problems that exist now in the current understandings of causal structures in neural systems, and the current use of time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Alexander, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Luis. Thank you for a great talk. I read the paper a couple of days ago, and actually it was very an interesting adventure for me. I work with causality today across fields, with business and academia, both of them. But I started actually starting from neuroscience. So my background, academic background, is in philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. And some 6-7 years ago, I was taking part in a neuroscientific hackathon where we're trying to look into the concept of functional connectivity and try to see if this concept could be somehow translated to other complex systems like economy or interactions between social groups and so on and so on. And that was actually the first time when I realized that associative attempts to define concepts like functional connectivity or associative perspective in general. And by associative, I mean based on correlation or some generalization of correlation, brings many problems in understanding what we are talking about, actually. And it's very difficult to define certain concepts when we don't have this causal background. So when I was reading the paper, I reflected back to that experience. And I also had I had a couple of thoughts. So first, I felt a little bit puzzled about I think that was the third meaning of mechanism that you define in the paper. And in relation to this third meaning, you talk about non-causal mechanisms or non-causal explanations. So this brings to my mind other similar concepts in other areas, for instance, finance or social sciences, where we sometimes say we found a strong correlation or strong correlation that is stable over time. And we know that this is not a causal, we cannot say this is a causal relationship, but there is some type of an impact. So this is kind of a slang that we see sometimes in the papers. And this impact is not defined. Its nature is not well defined, not clearly defined. And this seems for me, challenging in a sense that from a formal point of view, we can show that these kinds of correlations, even if they are stable in time, might be very misleading. And they do not offer explanation in a sense that they do not tell us anything about the underlying data generating process. So this can be shown very clearly in the framework that comes from Judea Pearl. And I don't know if you're aware of this framework. I noticed that you do not cite Pearl in the paper, but certainly that doesn't mean that that this is not something that you worked with in different contexts. Yeah, so I would be very curious if you're familiar with the works of Judea Pearl and his formalization of causality. And if so, if you think that this could be potentially a unifying framework in the field that could help clarify what we mean by mechanism and what we mean by causality. I also had a feeling that somehow implicitly the paper says that there is no clarity regarding the definition of causality in the field in general. So that would be my first question to you, Lauren. And thank you for the talk. It was a great talk.
Thank you for the great question. Yeah, I would say it isn't that there's no clarity on causality. There's no consensus on how to define causality in philosophy, which is, just a pretty obvious claim. And I do think the work of Pearl can help clarify causation. I'm not sure about it clarifying mechanism. The work that we do cite on causation in the paper, the philosophical work, and some of the main philosophical accounts of causation, for example, from Woodward, are motivated by Pearl's work in computer science, but also work in cognitive psychology about humans, how they causally reason, their causal cognition. It combines insights from both of those. And so that's very much how many philosophers of science think of causation. So there is a nice connection there. It's interesting that, so the non-causal use of mechanism, part of what we don't suggest in the paper is that all explanations in neuroscience need to be causal. We, in philosophy of science right now, and in, over the last at least 3 decades, there have been interest in types of non-causal explanations. They're sometimes called mathematical explanations. One of the papers that we cite, it's Site 64, is work by a philosopher of neuroscience, Masvita Chiramuda, and she talks about one example of a dynamical model that's giving a non-causal mathematical explanation. So there's one example there that's suggested to capture an explanation that's not causal. So it's interesting to consider, and there's lots of debate about what do non-causal explanations look like? How are they different from causal explanations? Huge discussions about that. And the interest here is the focus on mechanism is intended to capture causal explanations. So without saying that all explanations are causal, here we're interested in distinguishing types of causes and causal systems, how they can provide different types of causal explanations, while mechanism is sometimes used, as we suggest, to refer to models that don't yet have causal information. That doesn't mean they don't explain. It's just we want to keep those models distinct from ones that do capture causality and, kind of appreciate the different standards that these models meet. But yeah, there's a lot, as you are kind of mentioning. Each of these are kind of big questions in the field. I also want to make sure Dani has time to engage with this too.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that your answer, I don't have a lot to add. I think that your answer is really good. And that including Yeah, embracing both the part that I think I feel most strongly about as I think about my own work and the work in the subfield of neuroscience that I work in is understanding and valuing causal and non-causal explanations, and understanding the types of each. I think maybe going back to an earlier comment that was made, what feels important now is to be clear about the kinds of cause or non-causal explanations that we are seeking, and more clearly understand how those goals might alter the experiments that we develop, or the clarity of the hypotheses that we state, or the computational tools that we might be employing to excavate those causal or non-causal explanations. So I really think that this level of clarity is going to be very important in just the process of science, even up until the actual performance of experiments, or whether they're numerical experiments or physical experiments.
Thanks. Actually, let me just one quick follow-up. Sorry, Robert and Karen, but just a quick follow-up on this. So one issue, obviously, at the center of this is the definition of causation, right? So that we get, so we have this link there, mechanism and causation, but it gets fuzzy because we don't know what causation is, so to speak, right? In the sense that there are many diverse ways of looking at that. And one way that you were talking about, Lauren, just a minute ago, and I think it would be interesting to hear also Dani's take on this, is the issue of controllability, control, and it's quite strong link to the concept of causation, right? So one thing that I wanted to ask is, like, suppose you have suppose you're interested in some kind of ecological system, some work on fish populations and fisheries and whatnot that I sometimes take a peek at. And let's say you have some kind of model that is a bunch of that, and the kind of dynamical systems kind of type of approach, that you have a bunch of differential equations, you have a system, or you might have some kind of control theory kind of framework. So in that sense, it's mathematical and non-causal, but it might give you really deep insights into controllability of some kind of overall population growth or explosion or collapse and so on and so forth, and where you can manipulate the system so that it goes and steer in certain trajectories that are deemed to be healthy or non-healthy for an ecological system, whatever those may be. So I love the paper, but I still fear that if we insist too much on mechanism, we run into one of the problems I think that Conrad was bringing, which is, if I go into this and I have these theories and these models and I do it well, suppose, I'm still not considered as contributing possibly much because I'm not providing mechanisms. But perhaps I can talk about the system in really profound ways that would allow the system to recover. That would be great, to recover some ecological habitats and so on and so forth, that some more other ways that would be deemed more mechanistic would not. So it's not just the issue of the status, but of also understanding. And so I guess what I worry a little bit about is that the mathematical non-causal types of approaches sometimes can give incredibly deep insights. Well, I don't need to say that. That's physics, right? Most of physics. I mean, most of physics wouldn't you say, is non-causal? And so I just, yeah, so that's my struggle. And kind of I just any reactions, any thoughts as to these struggles and questions?
We sympathize with your struggle. I mean, one of the main points of the paper is that it's not that we rely too much on mechanism, the field is relying too much on mechanism. So right now, you are limited by the fact that this term is showing up in the grant and funding calls and in journal guidelines. So that's something that we agree with you is a problem, and it's a problem in ways that are complicated. one of the complications is that that might hold researchers to providing particular types of causal information when there's many types of causal information that are valuable for getting understanding of the brain. It might require them, or it might privilege lower level causal detail when, shoot, there's, that's not the only type that gives us understanding. It might, as you're suggesting, also privilege causal information over other types of mathematical dependencies that give explanations. So, so we agree, or, I should speak for myself, like, I completely agree. We're pointing out, look, this term is being referred to as the fundamental way you get the real deep understanding of the brain. And it's showing up in these kind of gatekeeping processes that are really influencing the field. Let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at why it's problematic. And you've nicely mentioned one of the ways in which it is. Of course, it's a long conversation about what types of information does the field value and does the field view as giving explanations and understanding of the brain. And so, yeah, very much agree with that.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Robert, sorry to deflect your question before, but do you want to
No,
provide your...
that's fine.
Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Louis, for organizing this, and thanks very much to Lauren and Dani for a great paper. I really like and welcome the paper. My questions focus on concepts about mechanism in particular. And I very much agree with your premise that the term mechanisms used in imprecise and variable ways. And I have overlapping issues with the way these terms particularly have been used in comparative psychology and neurocognitive evolution, which is my research interests. I've been especially bothered by the term cognitive mechanism, which I think is probably an oxymoron. But I've got two sort of interlinked questions. So I'm an evolutionary biologist, essentially interested in brains and cognition. And as a biologist, for me, the term mechanism, perhaps this is a bit simplistic, but it implies an arrangement of parts whose arrangement supports its functional properties. And in biology, complicated structures with functional properties exist ultimately because they evolved. In some sense, they're adaptations. In your paper, you don't mention evolution, and I just wonder whether that kind of perspective might help to clarify what the term mechanism should mean. So that's one question. And then the second one is I've been bothered in particular for a while about the conflation of mechanism and process. So processes are clearly things that have a temporal dimension, which has been referred to. And those seem to be very often conflated with mechanisms that, as I suggest, consist of a spatial arrangement of physical parts. And mechanisms then have causal effects by implementing processes, perhaps, but they're not. So they're related, but they're not the same thing. So that's why I think cognitive mechanism may be an oxymoron, because cognitive process I can kind of understand, but I don't think the word mechanism goes with it in that way. Also, one particular paper I came across that said that associative learning is a domain general cognitive mechanism, and in contrast with domain specific mechanisms. And I just thought that's really replete with a whole bunch of conflations. And I think, so essentially the second part of my question is agreeing very much that we need to think about these conflations and clarify what we mean by these terms in order not to be talking past each other. And I wondered what you think about the relation between mechanism and process, and is that sort of how you see things as well?
It's how a lot of philosophers of science see things. In fact, one of the biggest pushbacks to the use of mechanism as the kind of one way in which neuroscientists explain has been with philosophers who suggest, just as you say, that there are process type causal systems that aren't well understood as mechanistic. So John Dupre and Nicholson are two people who were cited in this paper, and they and many other philosophers have very nicely detailed accounts, which are doing and very much in support of what you just said. The notion of process is distinct. It's not well captured with this understanding of mechanisms with parts, with some kind of spatial organization, which is exactly how it's often suggested in scientific contexts and also philosophers. So yes, this is one of the biggest pushbacks. And part of what these philosophers have said is that you trivialize the notion of mechanism if you expand it so much to just include any kind of causal system. And so there's many interesting debates that are very much picking up on what you just said. And then with respect to evolution, yeah, I'd be interested in what Dani thinks about this too. Of course, there's many things that can't show up in a paper of this length, especially, when you're a philosopher, this feels like a shorter paper. I do think evolution is important, of course, if we want to talk about function. In this case, the focus is a little bit more on causal systems as they are, not necessarily why they came to be this way. But if if we want to talk about the bigger picture, then that's going to come in, of course. So yeah, happy to let Dani weigh in on this too. But yeah, very nice question and comments.
Yeah, I agree that these points are really interesting and important. I think that it would be exciting, I think, to think about how evolution would inform the way that we think about all kinds of causal structures, or what sorts of causal structures evolution can produce or does produce. I think, though, that asking where evolution comes into play, and can it inform the right definition of mechanism. I kind of wanted to pause there for a second, because in the paper, I think we tried not to say that there was one definition of mechanism that was right and others are wrong, but to say that there are multiple definitions that they may have different utility, and some may have more utility or less utility, but we stopped short of saying that one is more right than the other. So I think it's interesting to ask, maybe, what definitions are useful, or when we want to use the word mechanism to relate to some description, and what utility that description has, and what utility it has for us to call it a mechanism. I think that's tricky. I think assigning value is often hard to language. But I think one value that I wanted to kind of emphasize again is that just clarity in which definitions we are using is very important, because then we can communicate with one another, and we can, I think, more globally support a diversity of sorts of science, and of ways of addressing scientific questions.
Thank you, Dani. Karen, do you want to? Robert, sorry, Robert, do you have any follow up or anything that you wanted to discuss?
No, thanks. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Karen?
Hi, thanks very much. Actually, much of what I was going to raise has already been talked about, and also I put a bunch of notes into the chat if people want to look there. I just wanted to thank Lauren and Dani for this fantastic paper, which I think it is really, really important to get people discussing this issue. Not only for how they think about their own work, but for those of us who do a lot of evaluation and reviewing. I can say, as an editor-in-chief of a major journal, I have discussions with my section editors daily and argue with them almost daily and try to push back about insistence on what some people think the term mechanism refers to, or even if we don't agree on that, about the importance of that. And I'm talking about discussions with people who I do brain imaging, and so people who work either at the cellular level, molecular level, or on the other end, the clinical side, who are looking for kind of classic understanding of the term mechanism, and those of us who work in those other levels of the nervous system, we get forced into using the term mechanism, otherwise nobody will pay attention. And then, of course, if we do use the term mechanism, we, you know, there's a distrust there that, like, what are you trying to pull on us, that this is not what a mechanism is. So, or even people who do cellular work, you know, if the reviewers don't think that they've nailed the mechanism, then they equate that with the importance or value of the work. So I think, to me, one of the most important things that you've highlighted in this paper is to generate a discussion about what is important, and what is good science. And so I don't know if we're really going to change people's minds, or should, about how we use the term mechanism, or even what we mean by causality, or whether you need to have causality for something to be worthy of funding or publishing. But to take a step back and say, well, is this important for us understanding a system? You know, so I put a comment in the chat about, you know, the structure of DNA. Well, if there was just a descriptive initial couple sentences about what the structure is, and somebody would say, well, you know, there's no mechanism there. You know, we're not going to publish that, right? So, you know, there always has to be foundational discovery work. You know, there's always this battle between the insistence on hypothesis-driven research versus data-driven or discovery research. So I think about this discussion about causation and mechanism in a similar vein. So I want to thank you for that, and ask whether you think what you think the next step should be. I'm certainly going to circulate this to everybody on my editorial board, and we'll probably have quite a lot of discussion amongst us. But what should we do about this? Because at the end of the day, we all want great science being done, and planned for and disseminated and funded. So how do we take this problem with terminology and interpretation and philosophy and circumvent it maybe, and come up maybe with other terminology that gets elevated to a high status level?
I don't want to jump in front of Dani here. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, Dani, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I said go for it if you have some ideas of where to go next.
Yeah, thank you so much for the just really clear, succinct comments. In some ways, it was a little hard in some parts of this paper to find evidence and support for some of those discussions about mechanisms that are happening at the scale in the peer review process. And a number of these discussions are taking place outside of the context of published guidelines and even papers. So really, really enjoyed kind of hearing your take on this from your perspective. Yeah, so I'm a philosopher of science. I study scientists and what they do. I study neuroscience. I study neuroscientists and their work, and they're experts at what they do, and they're often very clear on what the goals are of the field and what matters. Mechanism, in some sense, is just a term, but it's a term that's referring to things in the world and things that scientists care about. And so if it's clearly specified, what is it referring to that you think you need to have in scientific work for it to be valuable? That's a helpful place for the discussion to go. This isn't just, rose by any other name, or it's not just semantics. Mechanism is used to refer to very particular types of often causal systems. And so having a discussion about what those are is one way to start. And of course, there's other things that matter that aren't just causal systems that give us understanding, that advance the field. And so it really, I think could be helpful to kind of combat worries that this could just be a term or semantics with, what are the standards of the field? And scientists, I think, are perfectly capable and experts at discussing and talking about what these are. Philosophers of science can help in various ways, but just as you said, opening up that discussion is, I would think, one of the next ways to start kind of examining this and seeing if there is change that needs to be made. But yeah, part
So
of
I just wonder if you're calling for, or have thought about a call for some, international panel on standards to try to elevate some terminology to status so that people who are cartographers of the brain, just explaining what's there, are rise to the level of importance, or people who do resting state connectivity, or MAG or EEG or functional MRI, which is not evoked, is thought of as having value to describe what is there, not necessarily what happens when you perturb it. So I'm just wondering if this could be a way of launching some sort of international standards terminology task force, just throwing it out there.
Yes, part of, my intention in having an interest in this work is to get editors and some of these grant agencies involved. So absolutely. And as Dani was mentioning, an appreciation for the diverse types of work that the field does that matter. And so, yeah, having discussions about this in that kind of forum, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll let Dani comment on this too.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the more conversations we have at higher levels of scientific funding and across different countries that are supporting scientific funding is critical as we move forward. I think the fact that so many of the funding calls contain the word mechanism and use it in a very particular and narrow way suggests that we are missing out on funding and supporting and valuing a range of different kinds of scientific contributions that are both causal and non-causal in nature, or offer causal or non-causal explanations. So I do think that a broader conversation on this topic is absolutely warranted and sort of has been for a while.
Yeah, Dani, that's really interesting because one way of looking at this, so you could, so the funny thing is that even the funding institutions, this is my personal take, include those words, but they interpret it so broadly that it ends up not matching what a lot of neuroscientists would think is mechanistic, for better or for worse, right? So for instance, in IMH, as an institute that funds my work and the work of a lot of people, has a very broad conception of what mechanism is, including, I think, cognitive mechanisms that Robert was concerned about, and many other things that are related to non-evoked activity in the brain and spontaneous resting state and so on and so forth. So I think the language is used as if it's more precise or more strict in directing. I'm sure they have their own notions of what mechanisms are, and I'm not going to speak for them, obviously, but is this fuzzy zone of even the funding institutions saying things or using a certain language that they themselves from the outside looking, it's less restrictive, it seems to me, than I would if I had seen that definition that you have in the paper, for instance, for an IMH in particular. So I think it's even more confusing and even more important for a wider discussion and debate, because if the funding agencies are just using these terms because it's fashionable, but thought of it so loosely, then it gets really, I think it's just way too confusing from all directions, including the very funders that define our lives and whether we are successful or not, right? So I think the debate seems, and as Karen was suggesting, to even go broader seems even more important, so that the funding agencies and the journals, I should know this, but I forget, maybe Karen can remind us what journal she's editor-in-chief of, but
Pain.
it's incredibly important discussions, right?
Pain, the International Association for the Study of Pain journal, which is called Pain. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, it's 1:30. I'm very grateful for Lauren and Dani for sticking along the meeting for so long. I don't know if there are some final comments that you'd like to make, or if we can take one more question from Alexei, or leave it up to you. So do you want to make any final remarks as to maybe how should we continue these discussions, or any final thoughts after this broader discussion?
I keep worrying that I'll kind of jump in front of Dani. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the main kind of aims for me of the paper is taking place right now and kind of opening up the discussion and starting to examine more and see more what the standards are of the field, what what kinds of constraints and influences there are on the work that's being done, and see if there's a disconnect in what is getting funded, what is getting published, and what should be funded and what should be published, and a kind of appreciation for work that is diverse, and kind of making sure that the standards that play a kind of really strong role in either supporting work or not, or publishing papers or not, to kind of further examine how some of these kind of looser conception of what the standards are can play a big role there. So just very happy to be having this discussion. Of course, working with Dani on this was very rewarding for me, and looking forward to and happy to support the discussions as they continue.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, and then maybe just to add, it was also really amazing to work with Lauren. I really appreciate her perspective and what she can bring from her field to people like me who work in neuroscience kind of on the ground. In addition to that, I think that one practical action that a lot of us could take as we move with these ideas forward is to engage conversations with our labs, with our graduate students, and with our postdocs. And as we're seeing papers come across our desk that use the word mechanism, to really wrestle with how we're using it, and whether we're defining it, how clearly we're defining it. And similarly, as we are developing new proposals or new directions for scientific inquiry, that we think more deeply about the kinds of explanations we are seeking, and that we support in our own labs and in the labs of others a diversity of scientific explanations.
I think that's excellent way for us to wrap it up. Thank you so much to everyone, and hopefully I'll see you all soon for more discussions on neuroscience and philosophy. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.